Everybody, welcome back to DRTV, inaugural episode of Season 6. Season 6, Brian.
It's amazing.
Season 6.
Can't believe it.
We're here. It's exciting. We're here with Paul Maxwell. Paul Maxwell is an author at Desiring God. He is a Ph.D. student at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School outside of Chicago, and he also happens to be an acquisitions editor at Moody Publishing. Paul, how in the world do you have any time to study or work on a dissertation?
I have no idea, man. Yeah, right. Well, my number one thing I go to is that I'm single, which does help. Whenever I talk to married guys in the doctoral program and they say, "Oh, how long have you been married?" and I say, "I'm not," and they say, "Oh, that's so good. Wait till you finish your dissertation." and I think, "Oh, come on, guys, it can't be that bad." And they always say, "I love my wife and my family so much, but," and then they go into this whole thing.
They're impeding my research.
Yes, that's right. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I just try to get it all done, but to as good of a quality as I should. But I'm just super glad to be on the show. Thanks for having me on, guys.
That's great to have you on. So, seeing as you're not married, I presume therefore you have no children upon which to inflict religious trauma syndrome.
That's right. Yeah, no biological children. That is. Yeah, no doubt.
Paul, what is religious trauma syndrome, which is going to be our topic today? What is religious trauma syndrome, and is it like a legitimate category, something we need to concern ourselves with, or is it going to be another cultural write-off of somebody attempting to, dismantle Christianity in America?
Yeah, well, religious trauma syndrome is a term that has only just recently been used in the past couple years to refer to people who have symptoms of trauma, which we can talk about a bit below, but that is any kind of hyperactivity, emotional dysregulation, which means you're out of control of your feelings, you have out of control relational patterns, sometimes you bring people too close or keep them too far away, extreme coping methods such as addiction, and things like that. Those are all symptoms of trauma, and people who have them, who associate those with a religious experience, with an oppressive religious community, most often applied to fundamentalist Christianity. That is how religious trauma syndrome is being used. And I think that on the one hand, it's not being used in a very helpful or nuanced or scientific way. But on the other hand, I think that it expresses a genuine concern about negative experiences of religion today, perhaps just in America in the past 50 years or so, which is a unique religious environment, that do need to be named and that do need to be addressed. And so I hope that we can find a balance there. And I think it all comes by way of careful thinking and by our nuanced definition of the words that we're
Paul,
using.
But where does the gospel play into all this? I mean, we can philosophize all day long on this, but is there real hope we can offer people who are going through whatever their perceived trauma is?
Yes, I absolutely believe so. The difficult work I think is still yet to be done in discovering how exactly the gospel applies to a person who has been genuinely traumatized. So, as we mentioned before, the experience of trauma it often is a mixture of what one thinks trauma must be, especially when they've received that category for themselves, and a genuinely traumatic experience. And so where the gospel fits in, on the one hand, is in correcting our misunderstandings about ourselves that trauma can introduce and that others can introduce or even oppose upon us, whether we have or have not been traumatized. And so informationally, it does a lot for us. So that's one thing. And then on the other hand, the gospel, it speaks against the voice that trauma brings. So trauma inherently brings a message of hopelessness and despair. And so whether or not one can believe the gospel, which is a question that I hope we can get into just a little bit,
Sure.
it at least exists as a truth claim outside of the traumatized person. So again, because trauma is a subjective experience, what the gospel provides is an objective anchor that is not subject to personal opinion, that is objectively true, and that secures a hope for the victim of trauma that one day, even their worst experiences and even their worst symptoms will receive some degree of emotional resolve, and that the suffering they currently experience will be burned away at the coming of Christ. And yes, so I think that how many ways that can be applied are vast to the Christian life, absolutely. On the other hand, just to give due to those who perhaps feel that they have been traumatized by, say, gospel-centered communities or written off by gospel-centered communities, I want to say Christian theology also gives full weight to the reality that we are embodied beings. And genuine trauma has much to do with our neurology, with our emotions, with our sympathetic nervous system. And so, in a genuine sense, even our psychological experience of a traumatic event is conditioned by our bodily responses. And so, I want to say, on the one hand, yes, the gospel heals us and it helps us, but I want to qualify that and say that the gospel is also more than information. And so as long as we have that qualified perspective, I want to say the gospel can be put to work by people outside of us on behalf of us through physical touch, through positive, redemptive physical touch, through relationships, through safety, through a context of healing, through intercessory prayer. So the gospel can have all sorts of objective manifestations besides informational claims which contribute to our healing, which don't necessarily require us to give full cognitive assent to the gospel immediately and right away, because I was actually interviewing a secular author on the concept of self-hatred recently, and she would and I asked her about the God concept, and she said, "That's so interesting. I think most people who hate themselves are disillusioned with God." And I thought, yeah, I think that's right. And I think she's putting, I think that's right. And I think most evangelical theologians, they don't even want to acknowledge that. And I want to say that whatever the gospel has for us as a spiritual resource, we have to acknowledge that I think where I'm at right now in my view is that it is possible to experience religious trauma such that what we commonly think of as faith, meaning a full cognitive assent, becomes impossible for somebody because either the problem of evil or the problem of self-hatred or some other total barrier between them and God is simply unmovable. And it's not something that undermines the truth of the gospel. It's a true, genuine psychological barrier. And what I want to say to that person is, you don't have to overcome that barrier in order for the gospel to be at work and in process to change you and to heal you, and that the gospel doesn't require of you something which you cannot give.
Yeah, and this is right there in the Gospels themselves, right? When the man says to Jesus, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief," right? So
exactly.
Right there, there's this idea that whole idea of full cognitive assurance. I wonder if that's actually possible for anybody to never experience a barrier to faith.
Yeah.
Sometimes theologians over-determine the concept faith, right? So faith is not just assent; it's trust, right? And part of an aspect of trust is I'm going to trust this truth. I'm going to trust this truth that Jesus died for me and my sins are forgiven and I'm being renewed and I'm going to be raised up on the last day. I'm going to trust this even though I'm not at cognitive rest, right?
Yes.
So there's other aspects of faith. And so I appreciate your caution that sometimes let's not over-define or over-cognitize faith. Yeah.
But I think on the other side of that same coin, which is which I kind of gleaned from a few of the articles you sent along that were from kind of the opposite side of the camp that we would be on, a purely secular view, is they want to lump Christianity and all of this God language into some sort of piece that's out here, unattached to, and doesn't think about or consider how we're created, our minds, our bodies, the outside forces that impact us. And that's kind of where I started to find myself recoiling. I'm like, but Scripture does talk all about this. I mean, you're familiar with Christian Counseling and Educational Foundation as well, and a lot of their, David Pallison talks a lot about how those outside human elements interact with our understanding of God and our just all this stuff kind of built into this thing.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree. Yeah, and I think N.T. Wright talks about the concept of faith in a really helpful way. And he's using it to talk about infant baptism. And even though I haven't come down on that issue yet, I think it's a really helpful analogy.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
He has Moody and Westminster in the same thing.
My resume has not determined yet. Yeah, I know. But he uses a really helpful analogy, I think, which is so he's talking just for example, he's talking about the faith of an infant, for example, and he's saying that he uses the example of a balloon, and he says that a balloon, once you blow it up, may have a lot more air in it, but it is never more or less full. So when it deflates, it is 100% full. It is not, doesn't become empty. And I love that analogy to refer to, let's say, even an adult who has been spiritually traumatized. And I think I'd actually like to take this as an opportunity to say there is a place in theology called theological anthropology. So you have all sorts of doctrines, right? You have doctrine of salvation, doctrine of last times, doctrine of God. Theological anthropology is simply doctrine of man. And we are, the most common or popular debate in that world is dichotomy and trichotomy, right? It's been 2 parts, 3 parts. But I think that in the Reformed theology, there's a really helpful category that we think is postmodern and new, but is actually very common, a common term in Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, and it's called the imagination. And in the imagination, Bavinck says that is the differentiating ground of salvation and degeneration. And so I think that sometimes we think, well, what does trauma wound? Does it wound our body? Does it wound our brain? Does it wound our psyche? And I think that spiritual trauma happens when our imagination is wounded so that it is impossible for us to conceive of the gospel as true, not because God has created us in a way that's impossible, but because that which we have been created to be has been broken and torn and ripped against the grain, and that healing must take place even before we are able to believe the gospel. And what we look like as believing Christians when we don't believe is perhaps as maybe a deflated balloon or as a ripped imagination. However, we must conceive of it in order to do justice to the paradox that sin introduces into our experience of God, which is that I truly don't believe that God exists, and if he exists, he's not good, and if he is good, he's not good to me. How do you overcome that? Right now, that may be emotionally and maybe even intellectually and personally irresolvable, and God doesn't require more from us at this current time than that, even if his plan is to change us, and even if the gospel promise is that he's working to change us even in this life to move beyond that point, whether we get there or not.
Yeah. No, and I think you just like encompassed sin as a whole. What we were created to know and understand has been completely ripped apart and torn apart and just shredded to...
Yeah, fantastic. Good stuff. You had me at Bavinck, so...
He's like the world's foremost scholar on Herman Bavinck.
Well, I wrote my thesis and published it on Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics.
Are you kidding me?
Specifically his theological anthropology. So,
no, come on, give me a hint. Give me a taste of this.
I wrote you can find my dissertation for lots and lots of dollars. It's called Restored to Our Destiny, Eschatology and the Image of God in Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics.
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not kidding. And that's available by Brill Publishers in Leiden, Netherlands, for the small sum of $147. So please go and purchase it, all of our viewers, and I'm sure you'll enjoy that. No, that's really
The
funny,
only
Paul.
copy I've ever seen is the one sitting on his shelf. You know, he's like,
Oh, wow. Well, the next copy I'm going to have is going to be on my desk because I'm using Bavinck for my dissertation for sure.
Oh, well, there you go.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, then you need my book. There you go.
you need
Yes,
Brian's
I
book.
certainly do.
I don't know how you're going to afford it, but, you know,
I know.
small business loan, something like
Hey,
that.
you know, Brian doesn't have enough rights to like just give you a copy either. You know.
Oh, no, Brill, man, they're tough. They
I
hardly,
bet they are.
They hardly even give me a discount. So.
Wow, that's wild. You know, let's see. You know what? I'm looking for a quote here right now from
Herman Bavinck?
Bavinck. Yeah, I'm looking for the one.
Brian might have it
that's-
memorized.
Oh, really? Yeah, no, I bet you do. It's let's see. I'm so sorry, guys.
It's all right.
We're
No, you're
probably I'm creating a terrible editing situation for you here.
This is kind of fun.
Actually, I might just keep this all in. Yeah.
I know, right? Oh my goodness.
What's the quote about?
It's about the imagination. Okay. Oh, okay. Let's see. Here we are. This is great. Okay, so
Of course
here's
it's great.
Bavinck on the. Yes, that's right. It's Bavinck, right? Okay, so here's Bavinck on the theological imagination. This is what Bavinck says. He says, and you'll probably know this is from where Bavinck. Oh my gosh, I didn't even list the book. How's that possible? It must be volume 2. But Bavinck Reformed Dogmatics, volume 2, page 67. He says, the question concerning the origin of sin. The faculty and activity of the imagination must be considered. He says in earlier times, dogmaticians paid little attention to the subject. But he says that the mind, this is his explanation of how the imagination plays such a large role in all of human, the entire theological anthropology, all of human experience. He says, the mind entertains the idea of sin. The imagination beautifies and converts it into a fascinating ideal. Desire reaches out to it, and the will goes ahead and does it. Thus, in the case of both angels and humans, the imagination was the faculty that made the violation of the commandment appear as the road to equality with God. And
That's by the way, that would be
by
the way for our viewers. I know that you were going to run out and look for that. That would be volume 3 of Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics.
And I'm gonna one up both of you right now and say for our viewers, we're gonna put that quote in the show notes so you can meditate on it and read it. You don't have to go find volume 7 or 4. Translate the Dutch or whatever
There's
he's
only 4,
speaking
and
in.
that's volume 3.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. You know what? I that's a great call, man. As soon as you said it, I thought, of course, sin and salvation. Where else would it be? And then you know what? Because I'm sorry that I'm reading quotes to you guys right now.
This is like the nerdiest 8 above the pay grade we've ever had.
Oh my goodness, this is super nerdy. Let me read to you. Actually, this is a book I wanted to highlight to you guys. It's a recent book that came out there by a scholar named Deborah Hunsinger. And she is a professor of pastoral theology at Princeton, and she has a class called Interdisciplinary Approaches to Trauma, and she has a recent book called Bearing the Unbearable, and it's about how to apply the gospel to trauma, and she locates the imagination at the center of gospel healing from trauma. She says, traumatic loss lies at the very heart of the Christian imagination. And she's referring, of course, to the Father's loss of the Son. And then she refers to how the Christian can relate the gospel and trauma, which, Jay, was the question you just asked, which I think she puts it very well. And I read this quote to Dr. Van Hooser, and he really loved it as well. He said, Deborah Van Hooser,
Hunsinger.
Deborah Hunsinger said, if maintaining hope is the foundation of all healing, then the gospel has something fundamental to offer those afflicted by trauma. When human trust has eluded them, the traumatized desperately need an anchor, a point of reference, something or someone reliable in which to place their trust. We thus facilitate healing when we help the afflicted cry out their sorrow, rage, and tears to God. Prayers of lament, crying out to God for deliverance, seem to be faith's only alternative to despair. Instead of protecting themselves against pain, the afflicted are encouraged to go down into it, clinging to God's promises as they do so. And so I think that the gospel provides a reason and a light to accept a traumatic experience as it is, rather than to jolt against it. And while secular therapy would give the same advice as what I hope would be the best Christian therapy, which would be to learn to grieve the brokenness of sin well and to not fight against it, I think it's really only the gospel's theology of brokenness and the gospel's theology of grief and loss, which we encounter at the cross and in the very heart of the gospel, that gives us the existential resources to do what trauma really requires us to do in order to heal.
You know,
So thanks for letting me geek out.
Oh no, that was awesome. And on top of that, you brought the Psalms into our conversation too, with nothing but grieving and lamenting and crying out to God. And I'm reminded of a verse, Lamentations chapter 3, where he's saying, "How long, O Lord, will you grind my face into the gravel?" That's how I felt for at least a year or two. You know, it's like, how long are you going to grind my face into the gravel? But knowing that it's okay to cry. You don't have to have answers all the time. Like when you're going through, you can just.
There's a sense in which this topic. It's funny how we start out with this, what seems like a small topic, and theology is so much this way. This one topic. Well, let's talk about trauma, and we end up talking about everything. We end up talking about life, the universe, and everything, right? And not only that, we end up talking about the whole Bible. You're mentioning Lamentations. Well, what about the book of Job? Right? Isn't that entire book about trauma and dealing with trauma? Arguing with God. We have the Psalms. So it's so fascinating how the whole spectrum of Christian theology becomes relevant to even this simple question. Anyway, fascinating. Totally fun geeking out with you, Paul.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation, Paul.
Yeah, guys, thanks so much for having me and hosting me, and this has been so fun to do this with you guys, and I think that's so true. It's all absolutely a constellation, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this, Brian, just that Bavinck quote, that mystery is the lifeblood of dogmatics.
Amen to that.
And yes, in that, of course, in mystery, all of the loci of systematic theology becomes one. Yeah.
That's volume 1, or volume 2, by the way.
Right.
That's volume 2, the introductory chapter on the doctrine of God. You may want to check that out.
I love you guys. Oh my! I'm going to read your book right after this thing, man. This is great. Oh my goodness.
That's fantastic. Paul, where can people go to find out more about you, follow what you're doing, and kind of stay in touch with your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Just kind of the cliche. You can follow me on Twitter at Paul C. Maxwell Paul C. Maxwell. You can email me at paulcmaxwell@gmail.com. And then if you want to check out some of my writing, you can go to paulcmaxwell.com and check out some of my writing on Desiring God and the Gospel Coalition and For the Church and stuff like that. So
do that, and then tell all your friends about Paul.
Absolutely.
I think he's one of those up and coming super. He's gonna be super huge in 10 years.
Right, the definitive
he's
work
gonna be,
on,
we're not gonna be able to.
Christianity and trauma.
We're gonna have to go through an agent to get him on the show and stuff. It's
right. No way, man. I'm always here. Always a phone call away, man. Now you have my phone number, so I can't escape.
Yeah, that's my secret plan. That's my secret plan to get my cell phone numbers. Well, thanks for joining us on Above the Paygrade, DRTV. To find out more about Dead Reckoning and what Brian and I are doing, we've got a radio show, we've got our podcast feed, we've got some articles and stuff that we're going to be posting here soon on our blog and website as well. Go to our website, www.deadreckoning.tv. It's a brand new website. Brian did it in his spare time because he's a designer and coder. You never know that. Yeah, deadreckoning.tv to follow him on Twitter.
At Brian G. Mattson.
And I'm Jay Friesen, Friesen is my last name. You can stalk me and haunt me. And then, of course, Paul Maxwell. Thank you, everybody. For Paul, we don't have a live studio audience. If we did, insert a laugh track.
Insert a laugh track there.
We'll
or
do
a
that.
cheering clap.
Insert laugh track.
We'll do that.
Either one, man.
clapping.
Oh, dude.
Thanks again, Paul. I'm Jay Friesen.
And I'm Brian Matson.
And this is DRTV.